New generation Mini means new generation hot one, and this is the new Cooper JCW. Now, the Mini Cooper 3-door is now available as either a petrol or electric variant. You can check out our full review of the JCW Electric up here. Now, obviously, the main differentiator between the JCW Cooper 3-door and the JCW E Cooper 3-door is the powertrain, because where that car utilizes a single front-mounted electric motor, this uses a single front-mounted 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder engine, which produces 231 PS and 380 Newton meters of torque. Now, notably, this is less power but more torque compared to the electric model. This is paired to a 7-speed dual-clutch automatic powering the front wheels, providing a 0 to 100 time of just 6.1 seconds before barreling onto a top speed of 250 kilometers an hour. Now, more notably, this car also has its own soundtrack, which is interesting. Now, because this car has a combustion engine up front, naturally that requires a significant amount more cooling, which is why up front you get improved air intakes in order to help the car breathe, in order to keep it cool, and also to help feed the forced induction, which is why you get a much more aggressive upper grille here, replete with very large air intake openings. The same can be said further down, where you now get a checkered pattern for the lower front bumper, replete with JCW badging on one side. However, the corner air intakes, just like the electric car, are completely dummy. There are no actual air intakes down the side, which means that there is very little ventilation in terms of the braking. But I do think the front end of this car is a little bit more aggressive than what you see from the JCW Electric, although that is to be expected. Now, in terms of visual differences between the electric and petrol models, there are a few things that might set it apart. So, for example, for the petrol-powered models, you get this black surround around the full LED headlights, replete with its own sort of customizable graphics. And down the side, you also get contrast paneling around the wheel arches, which is all nice and clean and built into the bodywork for the electric model. Now, the reason for this is because this car is actually based off of the previous generation Mini platform, which is why a lot of the hard points on this car, so for example, the A-pillar windscreen mounting point as well as the mounting point for the headlights, remain exactly the same, because this car has a clamshell bonnet, whereas the electric model does not. Now, as for the wheel arch surrounds, I think that's probably just for looks. Now, in terms of rolling stock, they ride on the exact same 18-inch alloy wheels with the exact same design, replete with the John Cooper Works badging in the center cap. That's all well and good. However, the tires are a little bit different, because the electric model rides on Goodyear Eagle F1 tires, whereas this petrol model rides on Pirelli Cinturato P7 tires. These are suitably high-performance tires for this car, but the discrepancy between the two is a little bit odd. Now, moving further down the side, that's where you also see the other thing that differentiates the petrol from the electric, which is the door handles, because the petrol model still gets these more traditional door handles, whereas the electric model, it sits nice and flush with the bodywork, although both cars naturally come with frameless doors. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the side profile of these cars are broadly the same, although the electric model is slightly more aggressive because it seems to get slightly more aggressive side sills. I'm not sure why that wasn't included in this combustion model, but there we are. The back end also reveals a couple of differences between the petrol model and the electric. For starters, the electric has a much more aggressive rear spoiler, whereas this is a little bit more subtle, a bit more tacked on compared to the built-in one that you seem to have gotten from the electric model, and the third brake light lives here. Now, this back end treatment is exactly the same. So you still get full LED tail lights here, replete with a customizable LED daytime running light signature. You get Cooper and JCW badging here, as well as a Mini badge done up in black. But as you move further down to the lower bumper, that's where you see the biggest difference, because obviously this car has a much more pronounced rear diffuser, as well as a single mounted centrally exiting exhaust, which makes it look a little bit more aggressive compared to the electric model. But I feel that the electric model just has a slightly tighter back end design. I think that's entirely subjective, but I just feel that this doesn't look quite as good as the electric one. Now, as I have mentioned in many other Mini reviews, in case you've seen them, the Mini Cooper 3-door is not going to win any awards in terms of practicality, because that's it. Yes, you have a dual-level boot floor, which if you raise it, will allow you to fold the rear seats flat, completely flat, 60-40 split, yes, but there is no lip at all. However, if you lower the boot floor, you improve vertical space by about that much, which is negligible at best, and there is very little, if any, space underneath that boot floor, at least not for a significant degree. Sure, you can put some smaller items back there, but you're not really going to be fitting all that much. But again, this is Although a JCW, more importantly, this is a Mini Cooper, which means it is a 3-door, so practicality shouldn't have been your biggest consideration anyway, because for this money, you could have also gotten a Mini AIMAN. Now, the interior of the Mini JCW is a sportier affair because obviously you get these leather red seats with red stitching, you get some hatch up here as well as this red stripe. You even get John Cooper Works stitching here and John Cooper Works badging, and of course the steering wheel is a little bit thicker with perforations, and the overall upholstery has also been changed ever so slightly in order to again fit this car's slightly racier profile. However, it is worth pointing out the fact that there are significant interior differences between the petrol and electric models. So for example, because this car has a 7-speed dual clutch, this center console now ends about here where you find the wireless charging pad. The cup holders are now mounted sort of laterally as opposed to sort of longitudinally, and of course the center bin is now a little bit bigger. You also get this central armresting which does not move or open at all, and your USB ports as well as your 12-volt socket are mounted here. And the door cards are also completely different from that of the electric model. But most importantly, there are some specification differences between the petrol and electric car. Again, this petrol model is about 100-ish grand more than the electric model, and yet this car does not come with electric seats. This sunroof can be opened, but it is a 2-piece affair, so the front does open, but the sun blinds are manual both for the front and the rear, which means that from here, I can't open the rear sunshade at all. Additionally, the dash appears to be mounted ever so slightly higher in this petrol car compared to the electric one, which does mean that you have a much more hemmed-in seating position. It feels that you're more cocooned by the vehicle. But unfortunately, some of the idiosyncrasies remain. So for example, all the controls are centered on this central screen, which looks good, yes, but the operation of which is not so great because all the icons look broadly the same, which makes it an absolute palaver to try and manipulate when you're driving. But more importantly, because this car doesn't come with an actual instrument cluster, all your information is here, including things like your power, your RPM, your fuel gauge, as well as your speedometer. Now, this is not so irritating when you're driving the Cooper SE or even the JCW electric, because obviously the only thing you really need to pay attention to is speed. Whereas when you're in a combustion model like this, especially a hot combustion model like this, you want the ability to be able to see things like your engine speed, your RPM, etc., which you just cannot get from the built-in heads-up display, and everything is reliant on this central screen. Now, I mention this because with the seat set out in my driving position, with all the controls falling easily to hand the way I'd want them to, in order for me to actually see the engine speed, I have to move my eyesight from here to here. Now, the Mini JCW is the sort of car that people will bring onto a track, which means that, again, not having your RPM readout nice and clear on an instrument cluster ahead of the driver, or in fact even built into the heads-up display, is a little bit irritating, which means that you are again reliant mostly on like the sound of the car to figure out when you're kind of near your shift points, which is less than ideal. Now, in terms of the ergonomics, as I mentioned earlier, everything in here is broadly fine. The seat is very adjustable, and of course the steering wheel is also pretty adjustable if I can find the lever for it, for both reach and rake, which means that again it is pretty easy to get a decent driving position. You have paddle shifters back here in order to manipulate the 7-speed dual clutch automatic, which is adjustable through here, and of course you have experience modes in this car in order to adjust the various experiences that you have in here, although sport mode is triggered by the gear selector. Now, all of this is broadly well and good. In terms of practicality, you have this bin here, you have those cup holders I mentioned earlier, decently sized glove box, which actually goes a little bit deeper than you get in the electric, but more importantly, the door cards in this car are quite small, which means that anything bigger than a litre size bottle will be a bit of a struggle within this. But overall, I think that for a hot Mini, this is pretty much okay. It's not great, but then again, this car was never really aspiring to be the most practical thing in the world, so it's alright, I guess. Now, with the front seats at my driving position, about 170 centimeters, I have a little bit of headroom and a little bit of knee room. But because this is not the electric model, there is actually a pretty decent amount of clearance for my legs, which means that I can tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me, and I actually have decent under-thigh support. Now, I wouldn't want to be sat back here for more than maybe about an hour at a push, but overall, life back here is not as bad as you might initially expect. On top of that, because there are ISOFIX mounts back here, that also means that if you have a forward-facing child seat, they should be able to fit back here without too much issue, although a rear-facing child seat can be mounted to the front passenger seat in order to maximize practicality. And so overall, it really isn't all that bad. Now, in terms of amenities, I have basically nothing. I've got these hard, scratchy materials back here, which also includes my armrest, which is not so great. And the speaker grills here also add to like a little bit of risk of grating your arm, which is not so fun. I do have a singular cup holder here, but of course, air conditioning vents, USB-C ports, etc. Yeah, you're not going to find that back here at all. But then again, this is a Mini JCW, which means that what's going on back here is largely irrelevant, because what matters in a car like this is what it's like to drive. Now, the thing about a Mini JCW is that it is all about the driving experience, just like I alluded to earlier. And one of the most important factors in that is the engine, which in this is absolutely explosive. And in fact, your in-gear shove, even from ridiculous speeds, is just ridiculous. This car certainly feeds into that whole JCW driving experience, where you have a very emotive engine which provides a lot of that experience for you. So for example, this car has pretty strong induction noise, and it also has a really cool sort of exhaust runoff. However, these noises are only experienced from inside the car, because it seems that all of it is fake. Because as far as we can tell, this doesn't sound like that outside, which is a touch disappointing. Now, once we move beyond that, the power delivery itself is pretty good. This DCT responds decently quickly, and even though there is a little bit of turbo lag, I think the DCT does a pretty good job at trying to keep that in check, which means that at no point does it feel like this car is out of gear, out of puff, or out of torque, which is great given that this car has a top speed of 250 kilometers an hour. Now, the other factor to a JCW driving experience is the way this car changes direction. So as I mentioned earlier, this car runs on 18-inch alloys wrapped in Pirelli Cinturato tires, already a pretty good recipe for success. On top of that, this car actually uses a unique suspension setup where it uses an adaptive suspension system, which means that this car is able to adjust the damping rates based on the situation that it's in. I think it can recalculate the damping rates several times over the period of even a second. Now, what that means is this car controls body lean very, very well. And from the driver's seat, it also means that the response to steering input rather, is almost immediate. And as a result, it means that when you do want to change direction, it does so with an alacrity and response that is just truly like nothing else. This is very much a JCW experience, and I'm happy to say that even though modern cars have gotten heavier and they've necessitated more safety systems, etc., this car remains true to the JCW formula. It feels like an authentic JCW, which is exactly what you want when you're paying this kind of money. However, the JCW recipe is not an issue in this car at all. The issue comes from the car part of the car. So for starters, I'm on a road now doing about 90 kilometers an hour, and road noise is pretty loud. Yeah, and the thing is, it is surface dependent, because naturally if you're on a nicer road surface with freshly paved tarmac, for example, the noise isn't quite so bad. But the thing is, at no point does it ever really disappear. Now, I've driven this car on a variety of roads, and I can tell you now that even on the slightly nicer surfaces of the NKVE or the Elite motorway, for example, this car is still pretty goddamn loud. Wind noise is less of an issue, mercifully, but I think that's because the road noise does an excellent job at drowning out any potential wind noise, which means that refinement is not exactly the best part of this car. Now, the second part that's not so great is the ride. Now, because this is a JCW, naturally the focus here is on driving dynamics, and in order to provide the best driving dynamics that one could possibly muster up from a Mini, this car has ended up pretty stiff. Now, the overall design, the overall chassis of the car, the torsional rigidity of this car has been improved. Things like the damper mountings, for example, all of these smaller details have been improved in order to upgrade this car's drivability. However, that has come at the compromise of comfort, because while the Mini was certainly not the most comfortable car in the world, when we drove the Mini Cooper SE, for example, while it was stiff, yes, I would never describe it as uncomfortable. This car, however, I also wouldn't describe as uncomfortable, because this car is punishing. It's so stiff that unless you're on a perfectly paved surface, it is borderline intolerable. Now, I'm not a particularly elderly person. In fact, based on government definition, I've only just stepped out of the realm of being a youth. And yet, despite that, driving this car around for the last 4 days has resulted in back pain and neck pain, because this car is constantly fidgeting and moving over the road surfaces, and it responds to every single imperfection in the road, which means forget expansion joints, this car will hop and bounce over speed lines. Forget speed bumps or potholes, let's just not even go there. And as a result, your head is having to constantly adjust to the movements of the car, which is tiring in and of itself. And because the seats in the petrol model don't offer lumbar, it also means that your lower back is also constantly adjusting your back in order to sort of deal with the movements of the car. Now, of course, some of you may be saying that ultimately this is a Mini Cooper JCW. It's not a Cooper SE, it's not like a sport line model, whatever. This is a John Cooper Works Mini, which is essentially what this car is supposed to do. It's not meant to be comfortable, because that's not the point. And you're right. Entirely correct. But I also think that these cars are still meant to be usable and drivable on a day-to-day basis. And I just don't think, as you watch me jiggle about in my seat, we're in Putrajaya, mind you, where the roads are actually not that bad, I just don't think that this is quite the recipe for driving dynamics that I'm looking for, because it seems so stiff that you are bound to back out of a corner before, rather than attack it at full pace, which you would be able to do if this car was slightly more forgiving. Of course, I've no doubt that on a track, this car is fantastic. If you've watched our first preview drive of this car, where we went through like a sort of curated circuit affair, this car performed absolutely brilliantly on surfaces like that. But the thing is, the real world isn't like that. You will need to deal with speed lines like I am now. You will need to deal with potholes. You will need to deal with mid-corner undulations. And because this car is so unforgiving, it doesn't really sink into a corner. And so if there are any undulations in the middle of a corner, there is always a potential to upset the car. Now, what seems to contrast with this is this car's safety features, because Mini hasn't skimped out for the JCW. This car comes with a full suite of active safety features, including things like adaptive cruise control, blind spot monitoring, lane keep assist, lane tracing, lane centering, blah blah blah, all the nonsense that you'd want to find in a modern car. That's great. But the fact that you've also given me this incredibly punishing ride seems to go, again, at odds with the overall packaging, because if you're looking at this as a sports car, then active safety features may not really be a particular concern to you, and yet they're there. Now, that then begs the question, would I recommend the Mini JCW 3-door? Now, for a very specific subset of buyers, perhaps. If you're looking at one of these as a track machine, as a weekend car, as purely a toy, if you're one of those people who benefit from having a garage of cars, and so you have a choice of vehicles with which to choose or which to drive on any particular day, then perhaps the Mini JCW would make sense, because this car does drive brilliantly well when the conditions permit. And I've no doubt that on a track, very few cars will be able to keep up with the Mini JCW in the corners especially. However, if you're looking at one of these as a day-to-day driver, then I don't think that this car is quite it. For starters, the Mini Cooper JCW Electric has a more forgiving ride, which means that if it's the package that you're after, then that might be the better bet. And on top of that, if you're driving it every day, especially through traffic and so on, the electric powertrain will be a slightly better companion. However, if you're looking for an ultra hatch within sort of the 300,000 ringgit space that can do a little bit of everything, then you have the Volkswagen Golf R, which has a much better duality to its character and, believe it or not, is also slightly more refined than the Cooper JCW. But if you're looking for something that's even more involving, slightly less isolating, like the Volkswagen Golf R, then of course there is also the Toyota GR Corolla. I always get the name mixed up. You can currently get that with a 6-speed manual, which is a lot of fun. It's a fantastic gearbox, but of course, if you'd rather the automatic, there is also that for availability, although we're not entirely sure when, but it will be available at some point. So overall, does this car appeal to a specific set of buyers? Absolutely. If I wanted an out-and-out sports car, if I was looking for the sharpest driving tool, if I wanted the best handling, perhaps, automatic 3-door ultra hatch, then this is basically it. This drives really well, and as a driver's car, this car most certainly doesn't disappoint. However, if you think that this is the sort of car that you can drive every day, that provides enough ride quality, refinement, comfort, etc. in order to make this a daily usable package, then this isn't it. It's unfortunate though, because I feel that JCW Minis in the past have managed to balance that ability to offer performance and drivability very well indeed, whereas this car seems to err on the side of driving dynamics to the point where it has become borderline unusable as a daily driver. Ah well, there is always the JCW Electric. In any case, that concludes our review of the Mini JCW 3-door. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to notify every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including a link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe and jangan bodoh.